3 years since a mob of Americans stormed the Capitol, and yet the dark shadow of January 6 continues to hang over the fate of the U.S. democracy. According to a Washington Post University of Maryland poll, Republicans are more sympathetic to the rioters and more loyal to Donald Trump than they were in 2021, while over a third of all Americans now believe Biden's election win was illegitimate. Robert Pape is the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats, and he joins Walter Isaacson to discuss why political violence has moved from the margins to the mainstream.
Thank you, Biana and Robert Pape. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's been 3 years since the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, and you've been studying people who talk about using violence as a political weapon. What have you been finding?
Well, we've been finding quite a bit through detailed studies of every person that has been arrested for offenses related to January 6th, and then also following up those studies with detailed national surveys of political violence sentiments in the national population. And the big finding, Walter, is that this goes way beyond support for violence, goes way beyond Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. What we are now seeing are mainstream Americans and even affluent Americans, people with something to lose, willing to support violence for their political goals. And that is very difficult for our society to come to grips with. It's difficult for our politicians to come to grips with. It's difficult for the media to come to grips with, but it is the reality that we face and that we faced on January 6th.
Hey, what's causing this in people?
There's different causes probably on the right and the left. So we've been studying not just simply support for Trump, but that's been our main focus, but also there's some issues related to the left. But let me just focus on the main threat we face, which is the main threat we face is really coming from the right. And why is that the case? It's because in order to get serious political violence, either strings of lone wolf terrorism or mass violent collective instances like we saw on January 6th, you need a combination of things. You need not just a large amount of violent sentiments in the mainstream of the public, but you need political figures willing to activate those sentiments, willing to egg them on. This is why Donald Trump is a dangerous and uniquely dangerous threat. It's because what he's demonstrated on January 6th and even after is both the capacity and willingness to inspire significant numbers of people to use violence for his political objectives. And so that is really the danger from the right. Now, why would they do that? Our studies suggest that there is a serious belief and fear that there is a demographic change happening in the country that's happening maliciously. It's not just happening because people don't want to have children. The many figures on the right are touting what's called the Great Replacement. This idea that the Democratic Party is deliberately and maliciously deciding to change the composition of the electorate, not over 40 or 50 years, but in the near term, to fundamentally shift the nature of our political system. And you see this with Donald Trump's rhetoric, with Tucker Carlson rhetoric. You see this with Steve Bannon. These are just to name a few of the many, many individuals, both in the media and political figures, who are making this argument and causing people to be very fearful of immigrants and demographic change in general. Well, if you combine that fear with the belief that the system is rigged, that you can't solve the problem through normal political constitutional means, now you have the ingredients for serious violence, and that is what we are experiencing.
Now, you say it's mainly on the right, and yet I saw in your surveys that 9%, which is a higher number than on the right, 9% of the left feels it'd be permissible to use violence to keep Trump from being president.
Yes, that is exactly right, Walter. So what we've done is not only focused on one side of the political spectrum, we want a 360 view of what's in front of us. And what we see on the left are a significant number of people in the mainstream who would be willing to support political violence. And as you say, the numbers are actually slightly higher in terms of raw numbers on the left than on the right. The difference is that on the left, the main leader of the left, Joe Biden, has been the opposite of Donald Trump. Rather than pour gasoline on a fire with political rhetoric, trying to stimulate violence or justify political violence, what's happening with President Biden is, even for goals that are on the left, he has been trying to tamp down movement toward political violence and keep that anger vectored into politics.
Do you think that means that on the left you could end up having a populist left-wing leader emerge who taps into that urge for violence?
Yes, I'm sorry to say there is that potential on the left. This populist violence, I call it violent populism, Walter, is a combination of two ingredients. One is mass sentiments for violence in the mainstream, the body politic. The second is leaders willing to stimulate and trigger that violence. On the right, we have both of those ingredients, and that's what's making things so dangerous on the right, and why we see so many instances of political violence, whether it's even against Congress, members of Congress, which are really oriented around their support for Donald Trump. That is, people on the left are receiving violent threats if they oppose Donald Trump, and also Republicans who oppose Donald Trump are being threatened with physical violence in members of Congress. We're not seeing that to the same degree on the left. And why is that? It's not because there's not violent sentiments. There's actually quite a bit of violent sentiments on the left, whether it's to oppose Donald Trump or support the restoration of abortion rights. But what we're seeing are political figures on the left are making active efforts. Joe Biden's speeches on Roe versus Wade are a key example of this. On June 22nd, 2022, that's when the Supreme Court overthrew Roe versus Wade, that Friday. Joe Biden, early that morning, gave a long speech. He was very opposed to what the Supreme Court did, but he has a big fat paragraph in that speech, not simply a one-liner, that says directly that the left, his constituents, should not act out violently. And he says this over and over again about why this would be wrong in so many ways, and instead should vector that anger toward the ballot box and energy for voting.
There have been a whole lot of indictments against Donald Trump. Do those indictments end up increasing the number of people on the right who are in favor of violence to restore him, or does it tamp down the sentiment?
Yeah. So the indictments against Donald Trump are increasing not just vote for Trump, as we now know, but radical, violent support for Trump. And we see this very clearly in our surveys. You see, Walter, our national surveys we do them every quarter. And what you can see is over time a clear spike up with the radical, violent support for Trump, with the federal indictments for Trump. And this is really quite worrisome because that's the component, that radical support for Trump, which is encouraging the violence. And that's what's underneath those continuing waves of violent threats even against Joe Biden threats against Obama, violent threats against the prosecutors. Just in the last few days, we've had a whole string of threats against state houses. That's coming from that violent support for Trump, which is growing separately from vote for Trump. And that's what's encouraging the violence. And that's what also could become even more extreme as we go through the events of 2024.
Circling back to January 6th and the attack on the Capitol there, you take some issue about the way people, the organized groups are characterized, meaning the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. Why is that?
Because we've learned a tremendous amount in the last 3 years about who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. On January 6th, if you look at the images, we know that there are hundreds, probably thousands storming the Capitol. But the media and many others tended to focus on a handful of examples. They tended to focus on the image of the QAnon shaman, for example. That was a very vivid image we will all remember. They tended to focus on the image of an Oath Keeper, somebody in the military garb, for instance. Well, that's very easy to focus on, but that very quickly became that this was Trump plus a handful of nuts here. Well, now that we have studied the over 1,000 people who have been charged, what we see is fully half are doctors, lawyers, architects. They are business owners. They are CEOs. They are executives from Intel. This is really stunning. These are all the years I've been profiling terrorists, politically violent individuals. I've never had to have a category called business owner. We've had a few odd examples of the white collar, but in this case, it's fully half of the individuals who stormed the Capitol. And these are not people that simply walking through this kind of nonviolent trespass. What we have in our documented studies at the Chicago Project on Security and Threats are image after image after image of a gynecologist doctor, the female doctor from Boston works at a very famous Boston hospital during the day. And then what is she doing? She's slugging it out with police in the rotunda, and we see this in the police body cam film. We have Intel Corp execs slugging it out with police, taking their batons and bashing them over the head. We have picture after picture after picture. So I don't simply mean that these more mainstream and affluent folks were kind of sauntering just kind of through the Capitol or being escorted by police. One gentleman, person, went to the White House Christmas party in December 2018. There's a picture of him with Vice President Pence and Laura Trump, and then he is in the rotunda. There takes 5 cops to hold him down. He's fighting them so hard, and he's saying, "Shoot me, shoot me." This is extremely violent behavior from what we consider to be mainstream, even affluent individuals. And this is the storyline that's been basically missed here. And I think it's because what happened is, quite understandably, the media wanted to focus on some key examples. They're often looking for the telling example to create the narrative. And the basic narrative for the media has been Proud Boys, Oath Keepers. And of course, that makes it very easy for the FBI is built for organizations to put down organizations like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. They were built to take down organizations like that. So that makes it very easy then to focus on these groups. But if you look at the whole, it's a much more disturbing picture. The 90% of who stormed the Capitol that the public really hasn't seen are more disturbing than the 10% we have focused on.
So those 90%, those business leaders and doctors and whatever, what radicalized them?
So we've been able to pour through all of the court documents from indictment to sentencing for each of those over 1,000 people. In many cases, there's hundreds of court documents related to each individual. Then we can also go through all of the social media posts. We can go through the other stories in local papers. And so what you see is that they gave statements, and many of them were proud of what they did, Walter. They weren't hiding. They were true believers. And what were they believing in? They were believing in Donald Trump's statements that the election was stolen. And number two, that they're doing this to save democracy. So in their view, and this view is coming not just from the media in general and Alex Jones, it's coming from statements from Trump. In fact, many of them are saying, I'm here because Trump called us here. I'm here because Trump told us to stop the steal. They're expressing it directly in terms of Trump told them to. Well, he is the sitting president of the United States. So when he makes these statements, Walter, he's not simply has an audience of millions of people. He has the authority that comes with that and that mantle. And for many of these people, he is still the president of the United States, you see. So that is why that it's not impossible for that to happen again, but it would take more of an orchestrated effort. But that's also why, Walter, it's important to see we've learned a lot in the 3 years since January 6th. And it changes, I would say, the narrative that we had then about 90 degrees. The narrative that we had is not 100% wrong. It's just off enough that we're missing the core elements of the real dangers to democracy.
You've mentioned Trump so many times in this discussion so far. If Trump were not around, would this phenomenon disappear?
Well, Trump clearly has been the leader of this insurrectionist movement. And I think it's fair to call it an insurrectionist movement because this movement is willing, and Trump has said, to depart even from the principles of the Constitution to achieve their political goals. He's clearly been the leader, but there have been a growing number of, you can call them mini Trumps and so forth, who are coming right out of the Trump playbook. This has happened in other societies, Walter. This happens in other terrorist groups, by the way. I spent 30 years studying terrorist groups around the world and violent societies around the world. Many people think, oh, if the leader would just go away, then everything would be fine. And the truth of the matter is that almost never happens. The truth of the matter is when the leader goes away in these violent movements, typically you get a younger, more aggressive generation who've got to prove themselves, and they typically are proving themselves through violence. So I think that there's a hope, I think, by many people that, oh, we just need to wait out Trump and or somehow Trump will just disappear for a variety of reasons and then everything will be simply fine. I think that's missing the forest through a very big tree of Trump, but I think it's missing the general landscape that we've now moved into.
Robert Pate, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.